Sandy, Vanover, Ed Newman, I thought it was interesting to note Nixon said the sign he saw during the campaign that touched him most was one somebody held up in, I've forgotten what town, saying, "Bring us together." It seems to me, and I wonder if it does to you, that the most immediate need in this country is something like that, rather than a lot of fancy new legislation out of Congress, because if the country is not brought together, it's not going to last. What do you think?
I agree. I agree with you, David. We've had a lot of legislation in Washington in the last 5 years. It was needed legislation. It had been bottled up for about 20 years. It was the unfinished business of the New Deal. But now it needs refinement. People don't like the big, massive federal programs. And what they need is something that I can only call the politics of soul politics. They do want to feel uplifted somehow. And I think that may be more essential right now than any kind of new legislation. They desperately feel, especially after this year that we've all gone through, the need for binding up the wounds. For the president, not so much for what he does in the Congress, but for what he is as a human being.
Ed?
Well, I agree also, David. I think a couple of things worth pointing out. I've done a little figuring on the popular vote, and it looks to me as though it's going to run about 73 million, which is really not very, not nearly so many as had been anticipated, not so many as had been hoped, which suggests that a good many people stayed away. The second thing is, of course, that it's an extremely close election, and it cannot be interpreted as any kind of resounding vote of confidence in Nixon. What the country is really telling Nixon, it seems to me, is we'll tolerate you, but we're not enthusiastic about you. And whether he can bring the country together in these circumstances, I don't know. I don't know whether anybody could in any circumstances because of everything that's happened. But that the need is there is plain, and judging by what he said, he certainly recognizes it. But the election itself, I think, has not been a healing thing. Maybe he can turn it into one.
Well, of course, Richard Nixon is a plurality and not a majority president. However, it seems to me he has a tremendous opportunity here, and if he lucks out a bit and handles it well, his popularity rating could be far greater than this word plurality suggests, because the country has indicated that it wants to be headed in a new direction. I think we're probably a little vague as to what that direction is, and maybe the country itself is a little bit vague about it, but Sanders suggested it. Maybe the end of big government programs. Maybe we need just some new equipment and new machinery to handle some old programs. But Nixon has a great opportunity here.
Chet, you know, every president has this period of grace, what I think the poet Wordsworth called the willing suspension of disbelief. People are ready to believe anything. And I think what Mr. Nixon has to do very quickly is to move to settle the Vietnam War, because as long as this cancer continues to infect the body politic of this country, he can't really get on with the unfinished agenda of the American democracy. And it'll be interesting to see how he moves, though he doesn't have responsibility for the peace talks in Paris, how he moves very quickly to ingratiate himself into the formula for solving this conflict.
Well, he does, as you say, have what is commonly called a honeymoon, a chance to do some things before his enemies gather and turn against him. I suspect that the Nixon years will be not terribly unlike the Eisenhower years, though of course he doesn't have the advantage of being a great national hero that Eisenhower was. He probably is the most popular president in our lifetime. Probably could be elected again if he were younger and healthier and it were legal. So I would guess it would be somewhat like that. Not a time of great social turmoil, of legislative turmoil, innovation, new ideas. I suspect we'll see very few, and maybe some attention to some old ones.
David, there is a somewhat uncomfortable point that I think has to be made, which is that Nixon is not entirely trusted by large segments of the American population. It doesn't matter that he's been elected. That continues to be the case. And that's going to complicate, make more difficult the task he has of unifying the nation. It's going to be terribly, terribly difficult, and the very narrow division in the election will not help.